The dinner plates were still warm on the table when the first crack formed between us. Not through noise or shouting, but in the way Marianne's hand stopped halfway to her glass. It was supposed to be a quiet holiday evening, candles flickering low, Mother humming an old tune from the kitchen. And then my sister looked at me with a coldness that didn't belong in a room built on 30 years of shared blood. I'd seen anger before, disappointment too, but nothing like the accusation hiding in her eyes. It cut through the soft clatter of silverware and settled deep inside me. Then she whispered a sentence sharp enough to still the air around us. "Someday, Elias, you'll answer for the way you bend people." Her fork slipped and struck the plate. That single metallic crack felt like the sound of something breaking far beyond the table. Mother went silent. So did I. And for a moment all I could do was stare at Marianne's trembling fingers and wonder what had been festering beneath the surface all these years. How does a truth stay buried long enough to turn family into something that fears itself? I didn't know it then, but that was the first tremor, the warning of a fault line running right through the heart of our family. And by the time night fell again, it would be wide open beneath my feet. Which is why hours later, when I returned to the old house, the first thing that greeted me was the familiar groan of the porch beneath my boots. The porch complained under my weight as I stepped onto it the same way it used to, when I was a younger man coming home late from work, smelling of sawdust and sweat. The sky above Mill Creek Road held a lid of low gray clouds waiting for the right moment to break. I pushed the front door open and the familiar scent of lemon oil drifted out, faint but steady, the way my mother kept it even in her weakest days. It settled somewhere deep in me, warm at first, then strangely cold as I remembered how long it had been since I last noticed it. Gerald Pike stood near the credenza with his file tucked under his arm, his posture quiet and formal. Marianne sat on the couch, hands clasped between her knees, shoulders pulled tight. She did not look up when I entered. The space between us felt like old ice, thick enough to walk on, thin enough to break without warning. Gerald asked me to sit. The living room felt colder with all three of us inside a room that once held laughter, now filled with the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Each tick seemed to lean forward, listening. Gerald opened the folder and began reading my mother's will. His voice was steady but had the softness a man uses when he knows the words might wound someone. The estate went to me. The house, the acreage, the savings, all of it. No explanation from Mother, no note of reassurance from Marianne, nothing to soften the blow. Silence dropped like a stone. Marianne lifted her head and looked at me. It was not shock in her eyes. It was history worn smooth from years of handling. She rose slowly as if trying not to let the anger take over, but it took her anyway. "So this is what you were doing, working her when she was too weak to know better." Her voice shook, but the bitterness underneath was sharp. I tried to speak, but she stepped back as if my breath alone could push her further into the hurt she carried. The storm outside rolled across the valley and the windows trembled under the coming rain. Marianne grabbed her coat. She paused at the doorway and looked at me one more time. Whatever softness remained in her expression hardened before she turned and walked into the rain. The door slammed shut and the house seemed to hold the impact for a moment before letting it fade. Gerald lingered, allowing the silence to settle before he spoke. He reached into his coat and pulled out a SME envelope. His voice dropped lower, almost respectful. "Your mother told me to give this to you only when the will was read and only if your sister was not here." He placed it in my hand. It was too light for the weight it carried. After he left the living room, returned to being just a house again, a hollow space with the rain gathering force on the tin roof. I sat in the old armchair and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, My mother's handwriting was careful but unsteady, as if written in a moment she feared would slip away. "Elias, you must know the truth about Marianne and about yourself." I read the line again and felt something shift inside me, a familiar heaviness I had not invited but recognized all the same. The house felt different. The hallway seemed darker. My mother's room door was shut, which she never did. For a moment I considered walking toward it, but something held me still, a quiet knowing that Mother's truth was meant to come in its own time. On the mantel stood a framed photograph of us taken years ago, my father with his fishing rod, my mother with her smile that was warm even on the coldest days. Marianne stood slightly apart from us, her hands behind her back. I remembered the moment clearly. 10 minutes before the picture was taken, my father and I had argued. It was sharp. Loud, the kind of argument that leaves a mark long after the words fade. Marianne had watched from the porch with that same expression she carried today, as if she knew more than she ever said. That memory settled into my chest, widening the space the letter had opened. Outside, rain began to fall in steady sheets, drumming against the metal roof and filling the house with a restless sound. My mother used to say, "Storms stir up truths we try too hard to bury." I never believed her until now. I folded the letter and set it on my knee. A knitted shawl hung on the back of a dining chair, one she worked on in her final weeks. The yarn trailed off in an unfinished loop. The sight of it pulled something in me that I had not expected, a quiet ache that rose and fell like breath. I stood and pressed my palm against the doorway, tracing the scratch marks from when I carved my initials into the wood as a boy. I remembered the scolding, the shame, the feeling that I had disappointed someone I loved. The years had passed, but the old feeling stirred again, patient and familiar. The house sighed with the wind. I looked at the closed door at the end of the hallway and the envelope in my hand. Mother's words lingered in the air. The truth about Marianne, the truth about myself. Whatever she meant, it was clear this inheritance was not a final gift. It was a beginning. I turned off the lamp. The room sank into shadow. The rain deepened its rhythm, and somewhere in the house a floorboard settled with a soft, deliberate sound, almost like someone shifting their weight in the dark. I stood still, listening. Maybe it was the house adjusting to the weather. Maybe it was something else. Either way, I felt the past move a little closer. I understood then that what my mother left behind was not just land or money or a house filled with memories. She left a truth waiting to be faced, and whatever it was, it would not only change the way I saw my sister. It would change the way I saw myself. The rain kept rising in waves against the house until it sounded like the whole valley was being washed clean. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and the letter in front of me. The single sentence from my mother holding more weight than anything she ever said aloud. The clock on the stove shifted from 11 to midnight with a soft click. I stayed there listening, feeling the house settle into its old bones. A sudden pounding at the door cut through everything. Sharp and desperate. Not the knock of a neighbor. Not at this hour. I stood and moved down the hallway, each step slow, as if the house itself was warning me to brace. When I opened the door, the wind pushed cold rain into my face. Marianne stood soaked through her coat, dripping, her hair plastered against her cheeks. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the porch light. She stepped inside without speaking. I closed the door, though the sound of the storm still pressed against it like it wanted to follow her in. In the entryway, she stripped off her gloves with stiff fingers and let them fall to the floor. She looked around the house as if she had not stepped inside it for years, though she had been here only hours earlier. "You sitting here like nothing is wrong," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the tremor traveling through it carried years of weight. I told her she could come into the kitchen where it was warmer. She followed, keeping her arms tight across her chest. I switched on the overhead light and its sudden brightness filled the room in a way that made both of us look smaller, like children caught awake past midnight. She stayed standing. I sat again, the letter still near my hand. She glanced at it but said nothing. For a moment she just breathed, steadying herself, and I could tell the words had been waiting at the edge of her mouth long before she knocked on my door. "You gotta leave," she said. "You got to chase your life." I stayed. I stayed for Mom. I stayed for every bill and appointment and late night she needed someone. And somehow all of that meant I was the weak one. Her voice cracked slightly. She looked down as if embarrassed by that small fracture, then lifted her chin again. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper. She let it fall in front of me, and I recognized the look of a credit card statement even before I saw the numbers. 47,000 paid in full, a stamp from a bank my mother had no reason to use except to hide the trail. She watched my face as I took in the numbers. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no triumph, only a tired kind of fury. "Mom did that without telling me," she said. "Do you have any idea what that feels like? To have your mother clean up your mess and never give you room to fix it yourself? To decide you are not strong enough?" I inhaled slowly. I wanted to tell her I knew that feeling. I wanted to say that shame comes in different shapes, but it cuts the same way. The words formed in my throat, then stopped. Something in her eyes told me she was not ready to hear anything from me. She moved around the kitchen as if the ground beneath her was unsteady. She brushed her hand across the back of the chair where the unfinished shawl hung, then pulled her fingers away quickly as if the softness hurt. "You know what the lawyer said," she continued. "He said wills can be challenged. He said things happen when someone is old and sick and being influenced." She hesitated there. Influence. The word lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. A memory flickered at the edge of my mind. My father on the stairs, my mother's voice raised behind a closed door. The kind of argument that never fully leaves a house. Marianne looked at me, and for the first time I saw not only anger but fear. I asked her gently if she truly believed that Mom did not trust her. I tried to keep my voice steady, soft, in a way that would not break whatever fragile thing hung between us. She froze. The house seemed to go silent for a long breath. Even the rain outside softened for a moment, as if waiting. "She could have told me," she said, her voice barely held together. "She could have told me why she left it all to you." Her shoulders trembled, but she stayed upright. I could see how much strength it cost her to stand there instead of folding in on herself. I stepped toward her, then stopped. She noticed the movement, and that small shift in her posture told me she was already pulling back inside, building a wall that would keep her upright through whatever came next. She turned and walked toward the front door. I followed her down the hallway, not close but close enough to hear her breath catch once. When she reached the door, she put her hand on the knob and paused. The porch light flickered outside, casting a brief shadow across her face. She spoke without turning. "She picked you. I will prove she was wrong." Her voice was steady, almost calm. That calmness cut deeper than the anger earlier. She opened the door. The wind pushed cold air into the hallway. Rain swept across the porch, and a loose shutter hit the siding with a hollow thud. She stepped out into the storm and did not look back. Her boots made soft thuds on the porch as she walked away. Then the engine of her car turned over, struggled, and finally caught. The red glow of her tail lights moved slowly down the road before disappearing into the curve. I stayed in the doorway long after the sound faded. The cold crept under my shirt, but I did not move. My hand rested on the frame where my initials were carved as a boy. The wood felt worn smooth, as if time itself had been passing over it, erasing things slowly. When I finally closed the door, the house exhaled around me. A soft click came from the hallway, maybe from the settling beams, maybe from something else. I walked back to the kitchen. The statement she left was still on the table. The numbers stared up at me, stark and heavy. The letter from my mother lay beside it, the crease down its center sharp from being folded too carefully. A gust of wind pressed against the window, and for a moment the light above me flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. The house felt awake in a way it had not in years, as if waiting for something else to break. I sat down, rested my hands on the edge of the table, and let the sound of the storm fill the room. The papers stayed in front of me like two paths leading toward the same truth. I did not pick them up. I just listened to the rain and to the faint echo of my sister's footsteps still lingering on the porch, fading into a night neither of us knew how to navigate yet. The wind pressed against the windows until they gave a low groan, the kind an old house makes when it is tired of keeping secrets. I stayed at the kitchen table until the numbers on the bank statement blurred. Then I stood and walked down the hallway without turning on a light. The dark felt easier to move through than my own thoughts. In my mother's bedroom, the air was colder. The curtain moved slightly with each pull of the wind, and the lamp on her nightstand cast a thin line of light across the floor. I opened the drawer where I knew she kept the envelopes she did not want anyone else to see. At the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, was the second one Gerald had mentioned at the reading but had not given me. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he thought I was not ready. I was not sure I was ready now. The envelope held a small recorder light enough that it barely pressed against my palm. There was a piece of tape on the back with a date written in her careful handwriting. 3 months before she died. The sight of that date alone made something shift in my chest. I took the recorder out to the workshop behind the house. The storm made the path slick and wet leaves stuck to my boots. The workshop door creaked as I pushed it open. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil rose up from the floorboards, a scent I had lived in for years, a scent thick with memories I never sorted through. I sat on the old stool by the workbench and rested the recorder in my hand. The wind rattled the eaves, and for a moment I just listened to that sound. I pressed the play button. Her voice came through thin at first, like a breath pushing through paper. Then it steadied. Elias, if you are hearing this, I could not tell you what needed saying while I was still here. I might have lost the courage for it, or maybe I waited too long. I closed my eyes. The room felt smaller. She spoke slowly, pausing to take breaths I could almost hear forming at the back of her throat. She talked about Marianne, about a man who had come into her life years ago. A man who talked sweet and moved fast, a man who told her she meant the world to him while borrowing money she did not have. And another loan, then another, until she was drowning. Your sister hid it because she was ashamed. I paid it because I was afraid the truth would break her. And I did not tell you because I feared you would judge her and walk away again. The shame in her voice was not for Marianne. It was for herself. For the choices she made in the name of love, choices that built a prison of sense around all of us. I opened my eyes and looked at the dust drifting through the beam of light from the single bulb overhead. The recorder clicked softly as it kept playing. I thought protecting her was the same as loving her. I see now I was wrong. I kept her from growing. I kept her from trusting her own strength. And I pushed you further away in the process. The workshop grew still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Promise me something, Elias. Never use this truth against her. Her wound is not the dead, it is the shame she has carried alone. I felt my fingers tighten around the recorder. The shame was real. I had seen it in Marianne's eyes that night, buried beneath anger and rain. The voice on the recorder grew softer, more fragile. If you cannot carry your sister's pain with her, you will lose her forever. A family is not held together by what is fair, but by who is willing to stay. She took a long breath. There was a small sound, maybe her shifting in bed, maybe the oxygen machine at her side. Then one last sentence, take care of what I could not finish. The recording clicked off. I sat there for a long time, feeling the workshop breathe around me. The sawdust on the floor had settled into patterns from years of footsteps, mine and my father's. I stared at those outlines, remembering the day I left home after we buried him. I had not thought about what that did to them. I only thought about how badly I needed to escape. A gust of wind hit the wall hard enough to make the tools hanging above the bench rattle against each other. A hammer tapped lightly against the pegboard, then stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy. I placed the recorder on the bench and rested both hands on the worn wood. My palms fit into the grooves left by years of use, grooves carved by my father and later by me. They felt like reminders of the things men pass on without meaning to. The storm outside thickened. Rain hit the workshop roof in a cold, steady rhythm. Somewhere near the back of the room, a loose shingle lifted and fell again with a soft flap like someone sighing. I reached for a sandpaper block my father had shaped himself and ran my thumb along the edge. It was smooth from years of his handling. He had always believed a man should finish what he started. I wondered what he would think of the unfinished work Mother said she left for me. I wondered if he had seen the cracks before any of us did. I leaned back slightly and looked at the recorder again. It seemed too small to hold something that carried so much truth. The workshop light flickered once, then steadied. I listened for the hum of the bulb, for the scrape of branches outside, for any sound that might tell me what to do next. Nothing came. I stood and walked to the door. The rain outside had eased into a mist, the kind that hangs in the air and waits. I stepped out and let it settle on my face. The cold of it woke something in me that had been asleep for years. When I turned back toward the house, the windows glowed faintly soft and warm against the dark. It looked like a place that wanted someone to come home to it, even if that someone did not yet know how to stay. I walked the path slowly, each step sinking into the wet earth. Behind me, the workshop stood quiet, tucked into the shadows. The truth my mother left behind followed me across the yard, patient and steady, as if it knew I was not done with it. I reached the back steps and paused, listening again to the faint whisper of rain against the roof. The air smelled of damp wood and pine. I opened the door and stepped into the dim kitchen. The table was still there, the papers untouched. The room felt different now. Not lighter, but clearer, as if the storm outside had shifted something inside, too. I rested my hand on the back of the chair and let the silence settle, not fighting it this time. The night was not over. And nothing in the house felt finished. The kitchen was still warm from the light I had left burning, but the air felt different when I stepped inside, as if the night had settled deeper into the walls. I closed the door behind me and let the quiet return. It stretched slowly through the house, filling the corners that the storm had left untouched. On the table, the recorder sat where I had placed it, beside the envelope and the bank statement. 3 small things that somehow weighed more than the house itself. I reached for the envelope to move it aside, and that was when I noticed the corner of a new piece of mail sticking out from under the others. A cream-colored slip with bold black print. I pulled it free. A court notice, the kind that did not soften its language. A petition to freeze the estate until further review. The words lined up with cold precision, each one landing heavier than it should have. Marianne had filed it earlier that afternoon, likely before she ever stepped foot on my porch. A hearing date was stamped across the bottom. 8 days. For a moment I just stared at the notice. The house around me seemed to tighten the way a body braces before a blow. I felt something slow move through my chest, not anger, not surprise, but an old ache I thought I had buried with the past. I walked to the living room. The mantel clock ticked in steady pulses, counting the seconds between who I was and who I was about to be again. I stood there until the ticking slipped into rhythm with the sound of my own breath. When my phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration felt too loud for the room. I answered without thinking. Gerald Pike's voice came through low, respectful, the way a man speaks when he wishes the news were better. "There is something else, Elias." Her attorney filed an exhibit, a police report from '97. For a moment, the air in the room thinned as if someone had opened a window I could not see. Gerald hesitated. He rarely hesitated. "They are using it to support a pattern, influence, coercion. I thought you should know before it spreads." I closed my eyes and felt the weight of that year rise from the dark, like a hand gripping my throat. I told him I understood. He said we would talk more in the morning. When the call ended, I stayed frozen with the phone still in my hand, the dial tone fading into the hum of the old refrigerator. The storm outside had eased, but something inside me had not. I walked back to the table, sat down, and opened my laptop. The county records website loaded slowly, the spinning wheel turning circles around an old chapter of my life I had tried hard to keep buried. There it was. Case reference. Date. My name. My father's name. The summary sat like a bruise on the screen. Domestic disturbance. Verbal altercation. Male subject intoxicated. Secondary party fell down basement stairs. I remembered the sound of the fall before I remembered the shouting. The thud, then a quiet that was worse than the noise. My father lying still on the cold cement floor. My own breath shaking in my chest. The officer's flashlight cutting through the dust at the bottom of the stairs. Minor injuries. Charges dropped. Family matter. Seeing it again in print made the room tilt slightly. The house felt smaller, the past closer. I closed the laptop, but my reflection lingered faintly in the black screen, older now, but carrying the same guilt in the set of my jaw. I stood and walked toward the fireplace. The embers from earlier that day were long dead, leaving only a thin line of ash that broke under my thumb. I used to think time erased things. Now I understood it only quieted them until someone else stirred the dust. My mind drifted back to the attic door that never closed properly, the one my father used to fix and refix because he said, "A house should never have an opening it could not defend." I felt the irony settle deep. I poured a small finger of whiskey into a glass, then picked it up again almost immediately and emptied it into the sink. The smell of it lingered sharp and familiar, and for one moment the kitchen blurred around the edges. I pressed my palms against the counter. The memory kept coming back. The sound of my father's boots on the stairs. The fight neither of us meant to escalate. The sudden slip. The fall. I had spent years convincing myself it was an accident, but the truth was more complicated. Shame rarely traveled alone. It carried anger, loyalty, fear. I was 28 and broken in ways I could not name. He was grieving our family in his own hard way. We collided. Now it lived again in a courthouse file for anyone to read. The house was completely still. Even the refrigerator had stopped humming. I walked back into the hallway and turned toward the window. Outside, the rain had thinned into mist. A faint light from the barn flickered with the wind. I felt the doubt settle slowly the way cold seeps into denim. I wondered if the will had been fair. Wondered if Mother chose me out of trust or out of fear of what might happen if she placed that weight on Marianne instead. Did I deserve her faith? The silence pressed in as if waiting for an answer. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with something quieter, older, something that had followed me through every town I worked in, through every job I took to avoid coming home. I reached for the bottle again, turned it in my hand. Felt the cool glass against my skin, the cap stayed on. I set it down gently and let my hand rest there as though grounding myself. In the living room, the floor creaked softly, a sound like someone shifting their weight. The temperature in the house dipped a little. It was nothing unusual for an old place like this, but tonight it carried a different weight, as if the house itself remembered what happened on those stairs in '97. I breathed in and out, slow, steady, letting the quiet wick through me. "Did you pick the right son, Mom?" The words left me without force, barely a breath, but the moment they slipped into the room, I felt something change. Not an answer, just the awareness that the past was no longer a shadow behind me. It was standing at my shoulder. I walked to the couch and sat down. The cushion gave beneath me with a tired sigh. Outside, the mist clung low to the ground, softening the edge of every shape it touched. The house lights flickered once, then held steady, casting a muted glow across the room. I leaned back, listening for anything. The hum of electricity, the faint drip of rain from the gutters, the shifting of wood as the night cooled. Every sound felt close, as if the house were trying to speak in its own language. I stayed there until the clock struck 2. Then I closed my eyes, not to escape anything, but because the weight of the past and the uncertainty of what lay ahead had pushed me to a place where I could only sit still and let it all settle. The room darkened as the last ember under the ashes cooled. The air grew almost impossibly quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a single board creaked, then nothing. The quiet in the house settled so completely that it felt like the walls were listening. I stayed on the couch until the darkness thinned at the edges, the first gray hints of morning crawling across the living room floorboards. I had not slept. My father's fall. My mother's voice on the recorder. Marianne's anger on the porch, all of it moved in slow circles inside me. A soft knock came at the front door. Not urgent, not hesitant, just steady. I rose slowly, feeling the stiffness of the night settle into my back. When I opened the door, the early light revealed Mrs. Lillian Carver standing on the porch. Her coat buttoned tight, a canvas bag in her hand. She gave a small nod, the kind neighbors use when words are too heavy for the first breath of the day. I stepped aside for her. She entered with the ease of someone who had crossed this threshold many times, though always at Mother's invitation. Her eyes moved across the living room, pausing on the mantel clock, the framed photograph, the shawl on the chair. She said softly that she had heard about the petition. Word moves fast in a place like ours. Her hands tightened slightly on the straps of the canvas bag. I asked her if she wanted coffee. She shook her head and told me she could not stay long. Then she set the bag on the dining table and opened it. The fabric rustled the way old things do, carrying traces of every place it had been. She said Marianne had come to her the day before, asked if she would tell the court that I isolated my mother, that I limited her visitors, controlled her appointments. Mrs. Carver's voice stayed calm, but I saw the hurt in her expression, as if the request itself had been a betrayal of something she held dear. I told Marianne no, she said. It was not true. Your mother was still herself, clear as ever, right until the last weeks. She invited me in whenever she wanted company. She talked about both of you, not with confusion, but with intention. She reached into the bag and pulled out a small notebook with a faded blue cover. The edges were worn, the corners bent inward from use. She placed it in my hands. Your mother wanted you to have this, she said. She gave it to me a month before she passed, asked me to keep it until the right moment. This feels like the moment. The notebook felt familiar before I even opened it. My mother had kept lists her whole life. Weather notes, grocery reminders, birthday dates from cousins long gone. I opened it carefully. The pages carried her handwriting neat and steady. Columns of medications, doctor appointments circled with small check marks beside them. Grocery lists with careful spacing, notes about the garden and the weather patterns that mattered to her more than seasons should. There was nothing scattered or confused in those pages. Each line reflected a mind still anchored, still present. Then I reached the page with the sentence that stopped me. Tell Marianne about the debt when she is strong enough. The handwriting dipped slightly at the end of the sentence as if she had paused, debating whether to keep writing. The room fell quiet around me. The only sound was the slow, steady tick of the mantel clock. Mrs. Carver's voice softened. She said she once found Marianne sitting on her porch steps late one evening. The wind had been cold. Marianne had been crying quietly the way a person cries when the grief is too old to name. She had whispered that Mom was the only one who ever truly saw her. The only person who did not expect her to be different than she was. The words settled into me like a heavy stone. I thought of the argument in the kitchen, the way Marianne held herself tight, the fear hidden beneath her anger. I had assumed she grew up feeling favored in ways I never was. I had never considered that she felt invisible in the very same house. I closed the notebook gently. The cover felt warmer than the air, as if her hands still rested there. I asked Mrs. Carver why Mother did not tell me sooner, why she had waited until the end to place all this weight into my hands. She gave me a long, kind look, the kind of look someone gives when they have already accepted something difficult. Your mother believed you would come home, she said. Not for the land and not for the will, for something older. She hoped the truth would meet you here when it was time. I nodded, though my chest tightened around a silence I could not form into words. She laid a hand on my arm, light and steady, then pulled back. Before leaving, she paused at the door, looked back at the living room as if she were seeing the shadow of my mother moving through it. She whispered that Ruth had tried to mend what time had frayed, but some threads needed stronger hands. When the door closed behind her, the house felt softer but not lighter. The notebook lay on the table before me, its pages open as if it were breathing. I sat down, tracing the curve of her handwriting, the ink still dark, the notes still clear. Each line felt like a whisper from someone who had been trying her whole life to hold a broken family together. A whisper that now reached me too late for her, but maybe not too late for us. The morning light crawled slowly across the table and touched the edge of the notebook, warming the ink until it shimmered faintly. The house stayed quiet, holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next. The house stayed still even after the sun climbed higher, but I did not. I moved through the rooms with the notebook in my hand, reading lines until the words stopped making sense and became nothing but ink and rhythm. Tell Marianne about the debt when she is strong enough. The sentence followed me from the kitchen to the hallway and back again. All day the phone stayed quiet. No call from Marianne, no call from Gerald, just the slow crawl of hours across the walls. I tried to fix a loose hinge on a cabinet door and found myself staring at the screwdriver without remembering what I had meant to do. The old habits of repair did not help with this kind of broken thing. By late evening, the sky over Mill Creek Road turned a deep blue that bled into black, and the house felt too small around me. I grabbed my jacket and the truck keys from the hook by the door. The notebook stayed on the table, its cover closed, as if it knew I needed to leave it behind for a while. The drive into town at that hour was muscle memory. Past the dark outlines of barns, past the grain elevator that always smelled of dust and metal, past the empty school parking lot. The streets of town were mostly deserted, just a few scattered cars under yellow street lamps. Edgewood Diner sat on the corner like it always had, its big front windows glowing white, fluorescent and unforgiving. The neon sign above the door buzzed faintly, the red letters blinking in and out. An open sign flickered in the window, even though the parking lot held only 3 cars. My truck made a fourth. I parked facing the diner and shut off the engine. The heat faded quickly, leaving the cab cold. I watched through the windshield. Inside, I could see the night shift winding down. A waitress wiped down a booth. The cook leaned on the counter, his arms folded, staring at a television I could not see. Marianne moved behind the counter, refilling salt shakers, stacking mugs. Her motions were automatic, the way a person works when their mind is somewhere else entirely. Steam fogged the glass each time the kitchen door swung open. The smell of fried food and old coffee drifted out when a man in a ball cap stepped out with a to-go bag and walked past my truck. He did not look in. I waited. The clock on the dashboard slid toward 2. My breath made a faint cloud in the cab. My hands rested on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just holding on to something. Finally, the lights inside shifted. One of the overhead rows clicked off. The cook disappeared through the back door. The other waitress shrugged on her coat and left by the side entrance, pulling her hood up against the cold. Marianne stayed behind the counter, counting bills and coins, slipping them into the register drawer. When she finished, she turned off the remaining row of lights. The diner dropped into a softer glow from the sign in the street. She came out through the front door with her bag over her shoulder. When she saw my truck, she paused on the top step. For a second, I thought she might turn around and go back inside. Instead, she squared her shoulders and walked toward me. I stepped out of the truck. The parking lot gravel crunched under my boots. The air was sharp and smelled of grease and winter. She stopped a few feet away, arms folded, her expression guarded. "You following me now?" she said. Her tone was flat but less sharp than the night at the house. The exhaustion was there in her voice, a rough edge that came from too many late shifts and too many heavy thoughts. I told her I wanted to talk where the walls were not listening. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had held any humor. "These walls listen just as well," she said. "They just smell worse." We stood there, the diner behind her, the truck behind me, the town around us, quiet as if the whole place had gone to sleep hours ago and forgotten to wake. "There is something I need to say," I told her. "Something I know now that I did not know the night you came to the house." She shifted her weight, one foot rubbing at the back of her other ankle, a habit she had as a girl when she was nervous. She tried to still it and could not. I told her I knew about the man, the one who promised her everything and left her with debt and nothing else. I told her about the loan, about the bank statement, about Mother paying it off. I said her name last the way I used to when I needed her to understand I was not speaking as a judge but as her brother. Marianne froze. Her hands dropped to her sides. For a moment her face went blank, the way a person looks when they have been hit with something they did not see coming. She asked how I knew. Her voice was quieter now. I said Mother told me. Not while she was alive, but in the only way she knew how. I told Marianne about the recorder, about the notebook, about the single line written in her steady hand. "Tell Marianne about the debt when she is strong enough." Marianne looked past me out toward the highway where no cars moved. Her jaw clenched, the muscle there tightening and releasing. When she spoke again, her words came slowly. "She promised me she would never tell you. She promised." I took a breath and let it out. There was no clean way through that part. She kept the promise while she could, I said. "She was afraid. Not of you, of what it would do to you." Marianne laughed, then a rough, brittle sound that broke in the middle. "Afraid of what it would do to me." She never thought about what it did to me already. To live with that sitting on my chest every time the phone rang, every time the mail came, every time a man told me I was lucky anyone loved me at all. Her eyes shone under the parking lot light, but she did not let the tears fall. She bit them back with the kind of force that leaves marks on a person from the inside. "That is the part that hurts," she said. Not the money. The way she decided I could not handle my own fall, that I was too fragile to stand back up, that I would break. I stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. The cold air moved between us. I told her I was sorry for leaving at 18, for walking away from this house and leaving her to carry more than her share. I told her I should have been there when our father drank too much, when our mother went to bed too early from tiredness, when the bills piled up on the kitchen counter. She shook her head before I finished. "I do not want sorry," she said. She looked at me, then straight on, and there was no anger in her eyes for a brief second, only something like desperation. "I want you on my side." The words landed with a weight I felt in my bones. For a breath, everything between us went very still. The noise from the highway, the hum of the diner sign, even the cold seemed to step back. I wanted to reach out and put a hand on her shoulder. I wanted to tell her that I was on her side, that I could have been all-eing if I had not been so busy outrunning my own ghosts. The words rose ready, but they never made it to my mouth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a small, harsh sound in the quiet. She looked down at the screen. I saw the way her shoulders stiffened before she even answered. She turned slightly away, but I could still hear enough of the one-sided conversation. A lawyer's name, a time, the phrase emergency hearing. The words moved up the side of my throat like stones. She ended the call and wiped at one eye with the back of her hand, more out of reflex than need. Whatever softness had been there a moment before slid away. Her face rearranged itself into something I recognized from the house. Armor. "They moved it up to 8 in the morning," she said. "Judge wants to fast track. I guess we are more interesting than their usual paperwork." She tried to make it a joke. It fell flat between us. I nodded once. There was not much else to do with that information in a parking lot under buzzing lights. She took a step back toward her car. "See you in court, Elias." She did not say it with spite. She said it like a promise she wished she did not have to keep. I watched her walk across the lot. The gravel crunched under her shoes. She unlocked the driver door and slid in. The engine turned over, then settled into a low idle. The headlights washed across the diner wall, throwing our shadows long and thin. For a moment she stayed there with her hands on the wheel, not moving. I thought she might get out again, might say something else. She did not. She put the car in gear and pulled away, the red of her tail lights reflecting in the wet patches on the asphalt before disappearing into the stretch of road that led back toward Mill Creek. I stood there a while longer. The neon sign hummed above me, flickering at the edges. Inside, the last of the kitchen lights went out. The glass door reflected my figure alone in the lot, framed by the empty booths and the faint outline of the counter where my sister had just finished another long night. The air smelled of old oil and cold metal. Somewhere far off, a semi rolled past on the highway, its rumble fading into the dark. I walked back to my truck and rested my hand on the cold metal of the door, my breath hanging in the air for a second before it vanished. The night felt paused, as if it were holding something just out of reach, waiting for morning to drag it into view. The courthouse air felt colder than the night I had left behind outside the diner. A thin winter light crept through the high windows, the kind that made every surface look harder than it was. I walked through the metal detector with Gerald beside me, his steady pace the only thing keeping my own nerves from showing through the cracks. The elevator ride to the second floor hummed beneath our feet. Neither of us spoke. The silence did not feel empty, only necessary. Inside the courtroom, the benches were nearly bare. A few strangers sat scattered along the rows, coats draped over their laps, eyes tracking us with mild curiosity. Marianne sat at the petitioner's table, her hair pulled tight, her blouse dark and severe against her pale skin. She did not lift her head when I entered. Her attorney whispered something to her, his hand resting lightly near her elbow. But she did not answer. The judge entered. We all rose. When we sat again, I could feel the wooden bench through my jacket, cool and unyielding. The room smelled of polished floors and old paper. Marianne's attorney stood first. his voice carried with ease, spreading across the space like he had done this 1,000 times. He laid out his narrative with slow, deliberate care. He spoke of vulnerability, of opportunity, of a son returning home, just in time to inherit everything. When he lifted the 1997 police report, I felt a tightness crawl into my chest. The paper looked thinner than I remembered, like the years had worn through the corners. He described the incident in measured phrases: alcohol, raised voices, a fall down the basement stairs, a minor concussion, no charges, but an incident nonetheless. His tone never changed, but he let the words settle like dust on a still surface. I kept my gaze forward, but my hand closed around the edge of the table. The wood pressed into my palm until it hurt. I did not look at Marianne. I could feel her looking anywhere but at me. He moved on to the medical note, a single page pulled from a folder thick with records. He read one line about fatigue, another about a moment of forgetfulness. The implication hung in the air. Early decline, reduced clarity, a mother too tired to know what she was signing. Gerald rose without hurry. His voice did not try to compete with anything. He simply spoke, guiding the judge through the larger record page by page, visit by visit. He reminded the court that mother read the newspaper every morning, that she still corrected his Latin pronunciations, that she refunded help with groceries even on days she should have asked for it. Then he called Dr. Howard Luttrell. The doctor walked to the stand with a slow, careful stride, his coat still dusted with the cold air from outside. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore in, and sat. His voice when he spoke was steady, worn at the edges, like a man who had carried too many stories for too long. He talked about mother with the grounded affection of someone who had known her not just as a patient, but as a presence. He recalled the way she argued about her medication, how she remembered details from years before, how she insisted on standing during every exam even when he told her she could sit. When Gerald asked about the day she signed the will, Dr. Luttrell did not hesitate. She was clear and decisive. She understood what she owned. She understood who her children were. She understood exactly what she wanted. He looked toward the judge as he said it, his expression calm, certain. There was nothing to challenge. When he stepped down, the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, more like a door settling into its frame. Gerald placed the small recorder in front of me next. The clerk carried it to the stand and connected it to a speaker. When the judge nodded for us to proceed, the room grew still. I heard my breath in my ears while I waited. The recording crackled once, then cleared. My mother's voice rose into the space, thinner from illness, but unmistakably her. She spoke of Marianne and the man who broke her trust, of the debt that almost drowned her. She spoke of fear, the kind that makes parents shoulder burdens their children never see. She spoke of her own mistakes, her regrets, her hope that I would understand what love sometimes asks a parent to do. When her voice trembled near the end, I felt something tighten behind my ribs. I kept my gaze on the recorder even as her words pressed into the walls of the courtroom. If you cannot carry your sister's pain with her, you will lose her forever. The last line settled over the room like snow on a quiet field. No one moved. Even the judge stayed still for a long moment before clearing his throat and calling a recess. Outside the courtroom, Gerald touched my arm and nodded toward the judge's chambers. Marianne and her attorney were already waiting by the door. She kept her eyes down, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Inside chambers, the space felt close and warm. The walls were lined with books whose spines all matched the air, heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. The judge removed his glasses and set them on the desk between us. He spoke quietly, but his words held no softness. He said this was not a case of fraud or manipulation. He said this was a family in grief standing on opposite banks of the same river, shouting across the current without hearing each other. He turned to Marianne and asked her to speak in her own words. Her attorney shifted in his chair as if ready to answer for her, but the judge lifted a hand. Let her speak. For a few seconds, she simply looked down at her lap. I could hear the small ticking of the wall clock above her shoulder. Her breath trembled once before she steadied it. I just wanted to know why. Her voice was thin but clear. Why she did not trust me, why she hid it from me, why he got everything and I got the part of my life I spent years trying to bury. She swallowed hard. Her eyes shone, but she kept them dry as if tears would make her words lose their shape. I was not trying to win, I was trying to understand. The judge listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly, then tapped a folder on his desk. He said the law's concern was capacity and intent, and both were evident. But the law could not heal what had broken long before the will was signed. He suggested mediation strongly and said dragging this fight any further would only widen a wound that had been open for decades. No lecture, no scolding, just truth. When we returned to the hallway, the air felt heavy again. Marianne walked ahead with her attorney, her shoulders tense as if bracing for weather that had not yet arrived. Gerald and I stood near the water fountain while he explained the next steps, but my mind already felt far away. The call came that afternoon. The clerk's voice was brisk and unreadable. The petition had been withdrawn, the hearings canceled, the challenge closed. I ended the call and stood in the quiet kitchen of the house on Mill Creek Road. The late-day light slid across the floor in long strips catching the edges of the wooden table. Mother's notebook lay open where I had left it, one page lifting slightly with the draft from the hallway. I walked toward it and rested my fingers near the open line without touching the words. The paper fluttered once light and fragile as if breathing. The house stayed quiet, waiting for whatever came next. The house did not move or speak yet. Something in it felt changed, as if the quiet itself had shifted after the call ended. The last of the afternoon light touched the floor in long bands, thin and soft, and the open notebook breathed gently with each small draft that slipped through the hallway. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle into me. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. The weight in my chest had eased, leaving behind a space that felt unfamiliar but welcome. I drove into town before the sky turned fully to dusk. The road was dry in places and glazed in others, and the truck hummed beneath me the same way it had since I was 20. At the county office, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. The clerk took the deed forms without looking surprised, only curious in a quiet way. She asked if I was sure. I told her I was. When the pen left the paper, I felt a small release along my shoulders, like something long held had loosened just enough to let me stand straighter. I drove to Marianne's place at the south edge of town. Her truck was parked crooked, one tire nudged over the line. When she opened the door, she had a look in her eyes I had not seen in years. Not anger, not relief, something closer to caution. As if she had learned to expect storms even on clear days. I told her about the land and the assets. She pulled her coat tighter and shook her head. Elias, I cannot take that. I let her refusal settle and said nothing. She stepped back into the apartment doorway and looked down at her hands, the way her fingers pressed together, white at the knuckles. The silence between us stretched, not hostile, only raw. She said she did not want to feel like I was fixing her life. Her voice cracked just slightly, almost too soft to catch. I told her this was not about fixing anything. It was about giving her space to stand on her own feet, without the old ghosts tugging at her. I said Mother wanted her to stand tall, and this was the closest I could come to helping her do that. She turned her face toward the parking lot, letting the cold air touch her cheeks. When she finally nodded, it was not out of agreement, but out of acceptance, the kind that comes when a person stops fighting themselves. She blinked hard once, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier. All right, Elias, if this is what you mean to give, I will carry it. We drove to the house in near silence. The sun had dropped low behind the mountains, leaving the sky an amber shade that reached across the fields like a soft hand. Snow had begun to fall in thin spirals, slow and deliberate, settling on fence posts and gathering along the edges of the road. The house came into view with its porch light glowing faintly against the dark. We sat on the porch steps, wrapped in coats, our breath rising in small white clouds. The boards creaked under our weight the way they always had when we were kids, slipping out to watch the sky change colors. The snow thickened around us, each flake drifting down with a kind of patient grace. She asked why I had left home at 18. Her voice held no accusation, only curiosity worn thin by years of silence. I told her the truth as simply as I could. I said I had been afraid of becoming our father, afraid of getting stuck in a house where grief had nowhere to go but sideways. I said I thought leaving would make me stronger, but it only made me smaller in ways I did not understand until much later. She listened without interruption, her chin tucked into her scarf. When she answered, her voice was low. I always thought I was the fragile one, the one who needed watching, the one who broke. The snow kept falling soft and steady. I let her words rest between us. I told her she had carried more than I ever saw, and that strength does not always look the way we expect it to. For the first time since we were children, the space between us felt level, not divided by old roles or old wounds. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of cedar and cold. I walked to the mantel where I had placed Mother's letter. It lay there as if waiting. The paper was thin and yellowed at the edges. I held it over the metal tray and let the flame touch the corner. The fire took hold, slowly curling the page inward. Marianne stood beside me, watching the words disappear without asking what they said. I told her only that some truths were meant to stay with the one who wrote them. She nodded once, and I felt her exhale in a way that sounded like release. I made a slow walk through the house before the night settled in. My boots echoed on the old boards, and the rooms followed me with their familiar stillness. The doorway to my childhood room held the same small gouge in the wood where I once slammed a toy truck too hard. I rested my hand on it. The paint felt cool under my palm. When I reached the living room, I pressed the recorder again. Mother's voice rose into the dim space, soft but steady. She spoke of what mattered, not the estate, not the division, but the family still tied together even in the frayed places. When the recording ended, the silence that followed felt warm instead of hollow. Marianne waited on the porch, her breath drifting into the night. I locked the door for the last time and stepped into the cold air beside her. She walked toward her truck, her boots making soft prints in the new snow. Before opening the door, she turned slightly, her face touched by the porch light as if she were searching for words that did not need to be spoken. She gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement that felt like a bridge, built one steady plank at a time. Then she climbed into the truck and drove down Mill Creek Road, the red glow of her taillights fading into the white. I stood there until the sound of the engine vanished and the snow settled gently around me. The night was calm and the hills lay quiet beneath their new cover, and in that stillness I felt something inside me open to the cold air light, and unguarded as if I had stepped into a life finally ready to begin.